Hi there, this is Victor Pross of Prosscast, and today I'm very happy to be speaking for the first time on a hosted show of mine, at least, Walter Block. And my co-host today is Patrick Smith. And today we are going to talk about three prominent books of Walter Block, who has, I think, what is it, 25 books that you have right now?
Yeah, that's about right.
But not necessarily counting. So, yeah, that's not no small feat, and I'm only writing my second book, so I've got a lot to do to catch up. Well, I am happy to have Walter with us. Walter and I go back a little ways, some I guess way back into 2013, I think, where I came across Walter. I invited him to speak at events that I was holding around Vancouver called the Real Sons of Anarchy. And it's been kind of like an ongoing thing. And I think in the second or the third year, I doubled it up to twice a year. And I've just been too busy to do it this year. But I've been a fellow speaker with Walter. First time I ever came across him, I didn't know that he was in the audience. I was debating a Zeitgeister, a socialist Zeitgeister, and he was talking about the robots running the economy, and I was speaking in the old terms of free market capitalism if it happens to involve robots as an offshoot of a free market, or whatever. But that's not where this guy was coming from, and that's what I was trying to draw out. And I was looking up into the audience, and lo and behold, somebody that I've known for 20 years, my whole adult life, that I've read before, and is that Walter Block? That's Walter Block? And he was very warm and gracious, and he introduced himself, and so ever since then, it's been all uphill from there. And I'm happy to have shook the hand of not only Walter Block, but also at the same hand that shook the hand of Ayn Rand, I presume, and Murray Rothbard. And who else would be in there? Von Mises or Hayek? Indeed, there you go. So I've channeling the best of the best. Okay, Walter, do tell us about the last three books on the series of privatization. Your other books have dealt with philosophy or in economic issues as well, but these are books focusing on the issue of privatization across the board. Is that correct?
That's correct. Thanks for the introduction. You forgot to mention that when we first met, when you were giving a talk, I attacked you. Why did I attack you? Because you were debating a commie, and I thought it was beneath your dignity. You shouldn't do it, but this was sort of a friendly attack. My first book in my privatization series is The Privatization of Roads and Highways. And Excellent. The impetus for this book was that some 40,000 people a year die on the roads in the U.S., and about 1/10 of that, 3,500 or so people die in Canada on the roads. And the usual answer or the usual explanation is not government's fault. It's never government's fault. There was this case in Italy where some bridge fell and killed a couple of dozen people. And somehow that wasn't government's fault. It was private enterprise's fault. It was a government road. The usual explanation for this is, well, it's speeding or vehicle malfunction or texting or drunken driving or something like that. And my response to that is, those are just the proximate causes. The ultimate cause is the road manager that doesn't do anything about it. It's sort of like if a restaurant goes broke, you don't say it's the fault of the lousy cook and the dirty circumstances and the poor service. You say it's the fault of the manager who didn't get a better cook, a better bottle washer or whatever. So that was one impetus, and the other was the traffic congestion. You guys are in Vancouver now, and after 3 in the afternoon or 9 in the morning, you sort of creep along. Cars capable of doing 70 miles per hour safely, or doing 7 miles an hour in bumper-to-bumper traffic. And my answer to that is privatize. My motto is, if it moves, privatize. If it doesn't move, privatize. Since everything either moves or doesn't move, privatize everything. And the idea here is that if the three of us I own one road, you own another road, and Patrick owned another road. There's the Victor Road, the Patrick Road, and the Walter Road. We would compete as to, how to stop these deaths. And, maybe in the U.S. it's a minimum speed of 40 and a maximum of 70. Maybe that's not the best way to do it. Maybe it should be 50, 60, and 80 or something like that, or maybe 60, 70, and 90. I don't know. I'm not a road competitor, but I am an economist. And I know that competition brings about a better product. I've got books in the background here. Patrick has got a whole bunch of stuff on his desk. You've got a painting behind you, Victor. We compete. The reason we have pretty good shirts and eyeglasses and shoes and stuff like that is because of competition. So I figured, well, maybe we could apply that to roads as well. And, if Victor did a better job than Patrick or me, we would go broke and he might take over our roads and the roads would be safer. Not perfectly safe. You're never going to have zero deaths with millions of people driving around. But instead of 40,000, maybe we'd have 10,000 and we'd save 30,000 people a year, which would be a very nice thing.
Well, Walter, yeah, one of the cliche bromides that's being shot around as a humorous meme of my roads, and my roads. It's the eternal question that's the libertarian or most, I guess, especially the anarcho-capitalist would be challenged with: is the roads become kind of like a ridiculous joke to you or I or Patrick? If we can conceive of a free market that can build something as intricate and complicated as the machinery of an automobile that propels people at a certain speed and all the electronics that it takes to build that, how complicated can it be when it comes to tar and sand and gravel or whatever the roads are made up of, right? How is that hard to conceive of? And I think the issue that confounds a lot of people is in terms of what they perceive to be as anarchy in the worst case, where all these crisscrossing of roads and people would have their own standards, their own rules, and it would be a cognitive, overwhelming procedure. And this is some of the complaints that you've been met with, and some of the challenges, the complications of it. They conceive of how it would be done.
Yes, well, I think you're quite right. One of the big criticisms of free enterprise on the part of the critics is, well, who would build the roads? The government's always built the roads. But as my book shows, the first roads were turnpike roads, and they were private roads. People would set up a turnpike, and this is long before cars. This is a horse and buggy and wagon, and they would have different prices. If you were in a horse, it would be a certain price. If you're in a wagon, it would be a little bit more. They even had prices based on the thickness of the wheel. Because if the wheel is thick, think steamroller, it keeps, remember these were dirt roads, it keeps the mud or the dirt without ruts. On the other hand, if it's a very thin wheel, think ice skates, it puts ruts in the road. So if you had a very thin wheel, they would charge you more. Private people would charge you more for a thin wheel than a thick wheel, because a thin wheel hurt the road more than a thick wheel. And they would charge you based on the number of horses and maybe the weight of the wagon and things like that. But then the government, which demanded the monopoly of force, refused to protect the turnpike road owners who wanted to collect a toll from people. So if I own the road, Victor, and you just went through my road and you refused to pay, the government wouldn't support me in my lawsuit against you. So then, of course, the roads were unviable. But this was because of the government. Look, take shirts. We're all wearing shirts. If the government refused to, like if you came into my store, Victor, and grabbed a shirt and walked out and I wasn't able to stop you, well, then we couldn't have private shirts. Well, then, of course, the government would have to make shirts, and, we'd go the Venezuela route. Half of the book is, and it's a pretty thick book, half of the book deals with objections. Another objection to private roads is the holdout problem and eminent domain. Suppose we want to build a road. I'm now in New Orleans. You guys are in Vancouver, and we want to build a road.
I'm in Vancouver, and Patrick is in Texas. Is that right? So the principle still applies to whatever the issues
whether it's Texas or Vancouver, it doesn't matter. There are hundreds, thousands of people who own land between. We're going to build a road that goes from New Orleans to Texas and then goes to Vancouver, and there must be, I don't know, 1 million people who own land between there. And the problem is, suppose you get a holdout who says, well, I don't want to sell you my land, so. Now we need the government, and in Canada they call it expropriation, and in the U.S. they call it eminent domain. Do we really need that? And I go through a whole song and dance in the book. I don't want to go into it now too much because it's going to take me a half hour to explain that if there was a holdout, what we would do is build a tunnel under him or build a bridge over his land, and we would just cut him out so he wouldn't be able to be a good holdout. And I go through all sorts of other objections, like suppose I live on a block and Elm Street and 5th Street are the cross streets in front of me, and Patrick owns 5th Street and Victor owns Elm Street, and you just don't let me out, or you make me pay $1 million before I get out or get in. So, now again, it'll be unviable. And what I say is on that one is, well, right now, before you buy any house, you have to have title insurance to make sure that you really have title to the house you're buying. Well, in addition to title insurance, we'd have access insurance. Before I bought that house, I'd go to you two guys and I'd say, look, you two guys own the roads right in front of my house. What's the deal? Can I get in and out? Or are you going to charge me $1 million? And then I'm going to get a contract out of you before I buy that house. Saying that you're going to treat me reasonably, you're not going to charge me any more than anyone else, and you have an incentive to do that because you want people to locate on your road. I mean, if nobody locates on your road, you're not going to have much money from payments on the road. And then there's the other thing. Well, it'll cost more, and right now we have freeways. Well, no, they're taxways, and you pay a lot more in taxes for the roads than you would pay. For private fees for roads. It's the same thing with shirts. Shirts, I don't know what they cost. A T-shirt costs $5. If the government was making it, it cost $100. So it'd be a lot cheaper under private enterprise. And what I do is I go over all sorts of objections to private roads, and then I try to say how it is that they would try to reduce deaths on the roads. And I think I make a decent case that we would be safer. We wouldn't have congestion because there'd be peak load pricing. And I make the case for privatization of roads, which I regard as a sort of a difficult case. It's sort of easy to privatize the post office or, privatize sanitation, because we do have private post offices, FedEx, and we do have private sanitation. So it's more of a challenge to say, well, let's privatize the highways.
Yeah, Patrick, go ahead if you have any questions or observations to include.
The roads is one of the more difficult ones. Certainly the most common one that people bring up when you talk about a free society or a libertarian society. One of the add-on objections that I get when I get into that discussion is then privatizing the justice system that you would necessarily have to handle disputes in that situation. For instance, I'm hopefully talking to Yaron Brook in October about this. He's a Randian that is a holdout on a libertarian, free, anarcho-capitalistic society because he believes that you can't have competition for force users, if that makes any sense. So if you're gonna, I know this is kind of off topic from roads, but if you have any thoughts on if you have competing corporations that are force users on behalf of its customer base, you're necessarily going to have at least the potential for armed conflict between those companies. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. There's this guy, Jan Helfeld.
Helfeld, yes. Yep.
Helfeld, who's a very eloquent guy, and he's also a Randian, and I've already had one debate with him, a 2-hour debate, and we're going to have part 2 in a week or so.
I saw that debate, and I got to say, it was rough to watch. It was a rough one to watch.
We were getting it on, and we're going to get it on again.
Awesome.
And I think that if you really take this seriously, let's say, Patrick, you're the government, and why are you the government? Because Victor and I might get into a fight.
Okay.
And if I get into a fight, we need some government to make sure that we behave. Well, if that's true, right now Albania and Algeria are in a state of anarchy with each other. as is Brazil and Burundi, as is Chile and China. They're in a state of anarchy with each other because there's no world government.
Yep.
So if it's true that we need a national government because local people like me and Victor could get into a fight, well, then it's also true, equally true, that we need a world government because these countries, there's a state of anarchy between all these countries, and they all have force. So do we really want world government? And I think that's the logical implication of that position. Another point that I make is, well, look, you Randians, you believe in the non-aggression principle, right? Right, yes. We all agree with the non-aggression principle. How do you start a government?
Yeah.
Right now, we just landed on the Earth. We're the only 3 people on the Earth, let's say. And how do we start a government? Because you need unanimity. And people, millions of people, just the 3 of us might come to a unanimous agreement, but
Maybe.
millions of people aren't going to agree to anything.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to use force against innocent people who just don't want to join your government, which is another problem with that position. But, I'm not really that dead set against minarchism, limited government libertarianism. I mean, most libertarians are not anarcho-libertarians, are not anarcho-capitalists. Most libertarians, I think, if you looked at the Libertarian Party of Canada or the US, most are, yes, we need a government for armies, courts, and police, and maybe 1 or 2 other things, and that's about it. But we do need a government, a very limited government. So to me, the issue of anarchy versus minarchism or minimal government libertarianism is not a pressing issue because it's very unlikely that we're going to get anarchy within the United States. It's more of a theoretical issue. Whereas, we really could get private roads if we wanted to save lives. Yes, it's unlikely, but it's more likely than anarchism.
I've been running for not governor of Texas in the Libertarian Party, so I'm very familiar with the pragmatist contingent in the party. And I would call them not libertarians or at least inconsistent libertarians.
Well, I agree with you, but there was this Dallas Accord for the LP.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that as well. Yeah.
Look, the Dallas Accord said, look, we anarcho-capitalists who are about 5% of the Libertarian Party, and you minarchists who are 95%, let's stop fighting about anarchism let's reduce the government down to the level that we both, that you guys want. Namely, let's knock out 95% of it, and then we'll get it on about the other 5%. But first, let's cooperate on reducing government to armies, courts, and police, which is what the Randians and the minarchists really want.
There was, I think we're up to about 27% now, probably, at least in Texas. I think we're up to about 25% anarcho-capitalistic voluntarists in the Libertarian Party. So we're making progress, at least in Texas.
I stand corrected. I didn't realize it was that good. No, I'm an anarcho-capitalist myself. I'm engaging in debates with, the Randians over this. And I think it's of theoretical importance, but not practical importance right now.
Agreed.
But it's fun.
The, go ahead, sorry.
There's an antidote actually in regards to the principle that's involved here. There's this one antidote that an objectivist told, who it was, I guess it doesn't matter, Leonard Peikoff or somebody, where he was at a party and he was being challenged on the issue of privatization, because this guy at the party was calling for the nationalization of the steel industry for whatever reasons. And this objectivist was pointing out the principle of the evil of the initiation of force in regards to, and using as an example of why that would be a disaster for the steel industry. And he was making all these rational cases for the free markets, the practicality of it, the ethic of it. And the guy goes, okay, I understand what you're saying, but that's as far as the steel industry is concerned. But what about the coal industry, right? And this is what the... And this is what the Randians call a concrete bound mentality, who can't think in terms of the principle and how it expands beyond just that one example, of course, right? So that's why I find your trilogy to be very interesting, Walter, in that you cover the issue of the privatization of the roads and the highways, and then you have a second book in case somebody asks you, yeah, but the rivers and the lakes and so forth. Right. So, and you've addressed that in the book.
And this book is co-authored with a friend of mine, Peter Nelson. And here we're saying that we should privatize, what is it? The case for privatizing oceans, rivers, lakes, and aquifers. I wanted to put in mud puddles, but the nasty publisher refused to have mud puddles in the title. But I'm just kidding. I acceded to their request to take mud puddles out, but I really want mud puddles in there too, namely privatize every drop of water. Why? Well, we had Katrina.
Before your answer there, Walter, give us the expression that you're known for in regards to privatization across the board. A quote. I love the quote.
If it moves, privatize it. If it doesn't move, privatize it. And since everything either moves or doesn't move, privatize everything, including roads. Excellent. And now bodies of water. So why bodies of water? Well, I can't say that 35 to 40,000 people a year die on the nation's waterways or in the oceans. I think it's much less, but still, we had Katrina in 2005, and Katrina really missed us in New Orleans. It was 40 miles east of us. It was, it was a heavy storm, but what the heck? Why did the 1,900 people die in New Orleans? Because the levees broke. The levees keep the river in its place, and the levees broke, and it flooded the city. The city is mostly below sea level, so it's sort of like a giant bowl, and 1,900 people died. It was really a horrible thing. Now, the humanist in me says 1,900 people die. I mean, that's horrible. There was this case in Thailand where about 10 little boys were stuck in a cave. And the whole country, the whole world was upset about this, because every life is precious, and we don't want to see people die. And here are some young kids on a soccer team, and they're in some cave, and they're about to die, and everyone was sort of rooting that they be rescued. Thank God they were rescued. But here's 1,900 people. So the humanist in me is outraged that this occurred. But the economist in me says, well, who is responsible? The Army Corps of Engineers. They built those levees. And then I say, are they still in business? And the answer is yes. Imagine if McDonald's killed 1,900 people. That would be it for McDonald's. There'd be no more McDonald's. We go to Burger King, we go to pizza, we go to whatever fast food. But that's why our economy is as efficient as it is. If you do a good job, you make more profit, and you can expand your base of operation. If you do a bad job, you lose money, and you keep doing a bad job, you go broke, and then you have to do something else, which maybe you'll be a little bit better at than what you just did, and you went broke out of. But it doesn't work that way with government, and the river is still run by the Army Corps of Engineers, which is an outrage from an economic point of view, because, again, imagine Patrick made lousy shirts. Well, he'd go broke, and if he somehow stayed in business, he'd inundate the market with his lousy shirts, and we wouldn't have good shirts anymore. That's not the way to run a railroad, to mix my metaphors. That's not the way to run the shirt industry or the river. So if we had privatization and the Mississippi River Corporation did this bad thing, well, we'd sue their rear ends off first, and then we'd make sure that somebody else took over the Mississippi River. Okay, so that's one part of this book, the case for privatization. Another part of the book is, well, who would get to own the Mississippi River? Well, it's the same as roads. Who would get to own the I-10 highway, which goes between Louisiana and Texas? Well, ideally, the people whose money went into building the road. Who would get? But if we had a God's eye view, we could find out who that was. If we didn't, what we would do is say, well, the people who use the road, the people who live near the road on the ground that they probably use the road more than other people. And the same thing with the river. I don't know how many people live on the side of the Mississippi River, both sides, from here all the way up north to Minnesota or somewhere. A couple of thousand or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And then there's the people who use the boats that ply up and down the Mississippi River. Well, they would get to own it. It's sort of like in British Columbia, there was this thing called BCRIC, BRIC. The socialist NDP government had a whole bunch of paper mills and forests and mines and this and that and the other. And then the conservative government came in and privatized brick. Well, we would privatize the Mississippi River, give 1 share of the Mississippi River to about 100,000 people, and now they're on the stock market like anyone else. Why privatize the ocean? Well, go ahead. Questions on the rivers.
Yeah, no, I thought if a question is occurring to Patrick, I wanted to give him a let's ray there.
No, I'm good. I'll butt in. Yeah. Okay. No, this all sounds great. Like an example of a failure when a government has something is like what exactly we're experiencing here in Dallas right now. We had a Dallas police officer at the end of her shift went into the wrong apartment, thinking it was hers, and murdered the guy that lived there. and rather than any kind of market response where there's actual, somebody getting in trouble, fired, sued, anything, we have the police department, circling the wagons, and we have the state police saying that they don't want to touch it, and we have judges, being begged to charge her with reduced charges. There's no restitution. That is the reason why your Ron Brook is wrong, is because if you don't have competition amongst the force users, then stuff like that happens as a matter of course.
Yeah, well, that's a tragedy. I hadn't heard of that. It must have been a recent case. I would call that a tort, not a crime, because I assume that this female policeman didn't mean to shoot him. It was she thought he was trespassing in her house, and she was scared of him and whatever. But still, she owes something. She killed somebody. She's got to, look, if my car hits yours by accident, I owe you something. I owe you damages. I broke your fender. If I purposely crash into my car against you, well, now I'm using my car as a weapon, and I'm now a criminal. So I don't think she was a criminal in this sense, even though she killed someone. It was more like an accident. I'm cleaning my gun, and it shoots off, and it kills somebody. It was an accident as on purpose.
Manslaughter, I guess.
Let me just talk about oceans. One of the reasons to privatize the oceans is that we're running out of whales, we're running out of fish because of this thing called the tragedy of the commons. It's sort of like with the buffalo and the cows. The buffalo almost went extinct because no one owned them. The cow never went within 1 million miles of extinction because they were always privately owned. So if you shot a cow or killed a cow, you would pay a high price, namely you wouldn't have a cow tomorrow. If you shot a buffalo, you wouldn't have the buffalo anyway tomorrow because it'd run off somewhere. So it costs you very little to shoot it, so you just shoot it with impunity. So we almost, ran out of buffalo and also alligators and crocodiles and things like that. Well, it's the same thing with fish. We're running out of these things because of the tragedy of the commons. If I have a whaling boat, if I leave it, you'll get it. So I might as well grab it. So there's no sense to preserve these stocks. And one of the interesting things is the Star Trek, Captain Kirk and those guys. There was this movie where our boys were in the 23rd century. There were guys in the 26th century who were kicking the crap out of them. Why? Because there were no more whales. So our boys had to come back to the 20th century to get some whales, and they don't ask it. I'm not making this up. It's really true. So one reason to privatize the oceans is to save species. And the idea is right now we have fish freedom. We don't want fish freedom. We want the fish to be in corrals. Now, it's true for whales, you need a big corral. But, we sort of have a couple of 100 miles that you own, a couple of 100 miles I own. And we have the technology to keep them in sort of like in pens, namely electrical fences. The only problem with privatizing the roads is the salmon. They're like a socialist fish. Because they go here, they go there. You really can't corral them. So they're a big problem. That's why I call them a socialist fish, commie fish, or whatever you want to call them. Another difficulty right now, the Chinese people are getting building little islands in the South China Sea. And it's just sandbars that they put a lot of sand and they make an island, and they're trying to claim the whole South China Sea. I don't think that that's really justified because the people that should own that ocean are not just the Chinese, but everyone who's been using that, including, the U.S. and Great Britain and namely all the countries around there. They ought to divide it up in some sort of way, and it shouldn't be owned by governments. It should be owned privately. But if it's owned governmentally, it should be owned by more than just China. And the problem is, I don't mind them owning these little atolls or these little islands that they're making, but I don't really much like this 12-mile gap. You see, it used to be that the country would own a 1 mile into the ocean because that's as far as the cannon could shoot. And then it was 2 miles, and then it somehow got set in at 12 miles because cannons could shoot 12 miles. Well, now we have intercontinental missiles, so that whole thing is silly. And in any case, it's not compatible with the libertarian view of how you get property in the first place. And the way you get property in the first place is by homesteading it. And here I look back to John Locke and Murray Rothbard, who go into mixing your labor with the land. And, we're not labor theory of value people, but I think we're labor theory of ownership people. If you mix your labor with the ocean or with the land, then you get to own it. So you don't own 12 miles out because you didn't do anything with 12 miles out. Just because you could shoot a cannon 100 years ago, 12 miles is totally irrelevant. So this book might shed some light on that issue as well. Namely, we should privatize the ocean, and it should be not China hogging up the whole South China Sea, but in some sort of reasonable way that we'd get ownership there.
Well, yeah, the gaining of values and resources, us as a species to survive, what the principle that applies to land can apply to the water, to the sea as well. Now, the probably much more inconceivably, I guess. Sorry, go ahead, Walter.
Let me just add one more thing. One of the things, another motivation for privatizing the oceans is, it used to be on the old Soviet Union that 3% of the land was private, the gardens in the front and the back of the workers in the Soviet Union, and they produced 25% of the crops, and 97% of the land was owned by the socialized farms, the commune farms, and they only produce 75% of the crops. Well, a similar thing occurs now on the oceans and the land. 99% of the world GDP is produced on the land, and the land is only 25% of the surface of the earth. 75% of the surface of the earth is oceans, and it produces 1%. Now, it's a little unfair because most people are on the land, not the oceans, but this gives you an idea of how unproductive the oceans are. And the reason that they're unproductive is that they're not owned privately, and when you own something privately, it's much more efficient. So it's not only efficient, it's also ethical to have private property.
Yeah, it would be revolutionary. Patrick, go ahead if you have any observations or questions.
I was going to do a shout out to Stefan Kinsella, who's been, I think, really trying and successfully doing so, iterating on the Lockean, property rules, right? So it began, you come across it first, you separate it from nature, you mix your labor with it. That's kind of like the big three rules, right? Kinsella, kind of discovered and put out there that labor has no inherent value, like you said, so we really shouldn't, take that into account. He kind of boiled the whole system down to just make first use of something. Get there first. You lick the handle of the car first on the lot, and that car, is yours. That kind of thing. Have you read any Kinsella? Are you acquainted with his work on that?
Oh, he's a buddy of mine, a good friend of mine. He lives in Houston. Your buddy in Texas, but I might even be closer to him geographically. I'm not sure which is closer to Houston, Dallas, or New Orleans, but I'm a good friend of his, and I'm a Kinsellian on intellectual property, for which he is most famous, I think. He is one of the top theoreticians of libertarian property rights, and I'm a big Kinsellian on individual on intellectual property. I do part company with him on an issue that we haven't got to yet, which we will, I think, the abortion issue and feeding children. So let me mention that now, even though it's a little bit off the water capitalism, and then we'll get to my third book, Space Capitalism, and why we should privatize the moon and the space race and stuff like that. So let me talk a little bit, since you mentioned Stefan Kinsella. I have to, first of all, I have to thank him because, there is this thing called the Lockean proviso.
Yep.
And John Locke said that, yes, we should privatize the whole earth, except if we start running out of earth.
Yep.
And then, we have the Lockean proviso, which libertarians don't accept. Namely that once most people own most of the land, now you can't have homesteading anymore. We have to divide it up in some sort of commie way. So Locke was not as good as Rothbard or Hoppe or Kinsella or our libertarians. So the issue comes up. Suppose you and your wife come home from the hospital and you bring the baby with you because your wife was pregnant and now the baby is born. And what you do is you put the baby in the back room and you don't feed the baby. Now, we libertarians don't believe in positive rights. There are no positive rights. There are only negative rights. The negative, I have a right not to be murdered, not to be killed, not to be raped, not to be stolen from. I have negative rights. I don't have any positive rights. I don't have any right to be fed or clothing, shelter, whatever. So the baby has no rights to be fed. So a critic of libertarianism says, well, you're not murderers if you don't feed the baby. And what I say is, you are a murderer if you don't feed the baby. And Stephan Kinsella was kind enough to call what I said the Blockian proviso. So how does the Blockian proviso work?
I look forward to the day when somebody starts calling themselves a Smithian. That means I've thought of something unique enough that people, adjectivize my last name.
Right. Well, Stephan Kinsella was kind enough to call this the Blockian proviso. So here's the situation. I'm going to draw a bagel or a muffin, and the bagel has 3 spots in it: area A, area B, and area C. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a bagel, and the question comes up: can you homestead in the B format? And let's assume that there is no tunnels and there's no bridges and there's no helicopters and there's no nothing. We're in the 15th century or something like that. And there's no pole vaulters who can pole vault over B area. The B area is 10 miles. This is 10 miles wide, so nobody can pole vault over it.
I would say
and I say no.
I mean, I would say
I say no.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead, Patrick.
I was going to say no because you've post facto stolen the center of the donut. You've taken exclusive control over that area by your donut of land.
Precisely. That's my point. I wouldn't say you've stolen it, but what you've done is precluded other people from getting to A. Namely, you control A and you haven't homesteaded A, and that's a bad thing. It's incompatible with proper homesteading theory. Proper homesteading theory is you can only own and control stuff you mixed your labor with, but if you homestead in the format B, you are now controlling A because no one else can get in there, even though you didn't touch A. So this is sort of an anomaly. This is a bad thing. This is something is rotten in Denmark, to use the Shakespeare thing.
Yeah.
And this would be, Walter, this would be also, this principle that you're pointing out here, this would also apply to the roads, to the parallels and the crisscrossings of different privately owned roads, right? The same principle would apply there.
You cannot homestead in the B format. If you do homestead in the B format, you have to have a little egress where people can get into the A area.
Yeah.
But this is not a positive right. It's that the crime that you're committing is precluding other people from getting into A. So you can't do it. Okay, now let's get back to that baby.
You're not allowed to use your property in a way that interferes with other people's use of theirs. And that could go for a gun, that could go for homesteading a bagel of land.
Precisely. Now let me get back to the baby. You can't own babies, but you can own the guardianship rights to babies. How do you homestead the guardianship rights to babies? You homestead the guardianship rights to babies by feeding them, by caring for them, by diapering them, by giving them milk or whatever it is. And namely, you're a good guardian. But you dirty rat, you just came home from the hospital and you put that baby in the back room and you don't feed it? Well, then you lose your guardianship rights, and yet the baby is like Area A. you're precluding other people. I'd like to homestead not homestead the baby, but homestead the guardianship rights over the baby. I would like to adopt the baby, but I can't get in there because you're this house of yours is akin to B. So
you're
what
going
I'm
to kill it.
Yeah, you guys are going to. Well, you're not going to really kill it, but you're going to allow it to die by not feeding it. You're not murdering the baby, but you're precluding me from getting to that baby, just as the B bagel homesteader is precluding people from getting to A. The person who doesn't feed that baby is precluding other people from taking over that baby. So you have an obligation, you dirty rat, to take that baby that you don't want to feed to the hospital, to the orphanage, to the church, to the synagogue, to somebody, and say, hey, look, here's this baby. I don't want to homestead the baby. I don't want to feed the baby, but I want to be a good libertarian, and I don't want to preclude you from it. So here, take this baby. Now, you might say, well, this is a positive obligation on your part. No, it's not a positive obligation on your part. Rather, it's a safeguard of you from the crime of precluding. So Stefan disagrees with me on this, and we have a little back and forth on the issue.
Can I throw my hat into that ring? Because I think I have a different take on it.
I'm sorry?
Can I throw my hat into that ring? I think I have a different take on it.
Only if you agree with me.
So I would say that there are no unchosen positive obligations, meaning I can take positive action to sign a contract obligating myself to do something, but you can't force a contract like that on me. And I think that putting a life in a situation of peril, and we kind of talked about this last time we spoke, where we were talking about, knocking somebody that can't swim into a lake, or even accidentally knocking them into a lake. We've placed a life in a situation of peril. We're responsible for the effects of our actions. So it's not an unchosen obligation. It's a perfectly valid, positive obligation to care for that life until it's out of a situation of peril. A newborn that, when we choose to make a baby, either, even accidentally, we're obligated to, take care of that life until we are able to pass on that obligation to somebody else that wants it. That's, I think, another way of getting to the same outcome you described, where we can't just leave it in the room because we have an obligation. We place that life in peril. It's going to die if we leave it there. We're responsible for the effect of our action that is, sitting in that back room. So we need to get it to somebody that can take that obligation off of our hands. What do you think about that?
We agree entirely. You are obligated to take that baby to the hospital, the orphanage, or the church, or to somebody who will take care of the baby.
Yeah.
But we disagree perhaps as to the way we characterize it. I don't want to characterize that as a positive obligation, because positive obligations are anathema to libertarianism. We only have negative obligations. The way I want to characterize it is that if you don't, you're committing the crime of precluding. So we agree as to the results. You got to bring that baby to the orphanage or the hospital or something. But you say it's a positive obligation. I don't like that language. Stop using the F word. I'm kidding.
Well, I mean, what's a contract? When you agree to, take care of a situation or perform something, you have a negative obligation to not break the contract. I mean, we're using double negatives to kind of get back. It's as long as you accept the obligation consensually, willingly, then there's nothing wrong with a positive obligation. There's no like a priori positive obligations. I certainly agree with you there, right?
Right. Well, there are contractual obligations. If I agree to sell you the shirt and you give me $10, now I have an obligation to give you the shirt.
Right.
But that's not a positive obligation. That's a contractual obligation. And obviously, if I push you into the water, whether accidentally or on purpose, and you can't swim and it's deep water, I have an obligation to fish you out, because otherwise I'm a murderer.
That's a positive obligation, right? To fish the person out? That's a positive obligation?
I don't think it's a positive obligation. It's rather that if you want to preclude being a murderer, you have to grab the guy out.
Okay. So I guess we're saying the same thing in two different directions. And yeah. Okay.
Exactly. We're saying the same things, but I insist that my language is better and you're using the F word all over the place, and cut it out. Because we libertarians have to hold the line. There are no positive obligations. And these seemingly positive obligations are instead to be interpreted as a contractual obligation, or the attempt not to be a criminal, or not to be a murderer, or not to be a precluder. So I think we agree in all three cases. It's just that we're having a verbal dispute, and I insist that my way of putting it is very important because we want to hold the line. We don't want to say that there are positive obligations, because if there are positive obligations, then we open the door, the Pandora's box, and now people say, well, you have an obligation to, I'm sick and you're a doctor, you have an obligation to cure me, or I'm starving and you have food, you have an obligation to give me food. No, no, no. No positive obligations. We have to reinterpret this so there are no positive obligations. And also, we want to be, what's the word, pragmatic or utilitarian, or we want to be normal. We don't want to have the people think that we libertarians agree that it's okay to starve babies or to leave people in deep water after you push them in. I mean, that's just a horror. So we don't want that, but I insist that language is important and that we eschew the language of positive obligations. Yes, contractual obligations. You don't want to be a criminal, so you fish me out after you push me in. You can't let that baby starve because you're engaging in the Blockian proviso, as Stephen Kinsella was kind enough to call it.
I will accept your criticism and reconsider the use of my profanity. I always say there are no unchosen positive obligations, but I think that's that might be a more complicated way of saying it. So I will reconsider. Thank you.
Okay, let me talk about my third book. This is the
final in the trilogy. The same principles that applies to land, that applies to sea, now applies to space.
Right. This book is also co-authored with Peter Nelson. I was the first author on the water capitalism. He's the first author here. We take turns because it's really a product of both of us. We each contributed 50-50 to both books. We started this and he added, I added, and that's how we got both books. So what's going on with space? Why should we privatize not only the space race, but also when we get there, privatize the moon and privatize Mars, which would be the first two places that we'll get to? Well, my impetus here is I'm a humanist. I like human beings. Some of my best friends are human beings. My wife, my kids, my grandchildren, they're all human beings. I am pro-human being. And I noticed that human beings are sons of bitches. We're always on the verge of a nuclear war or this or that, and I figure that if we've got colonies on the moon and colonies on Mars and the Earth blows itself up, God forbid, at least the human beings will survive if we have colonies on Mars and the moon. So I favor colonization of Mars and moon because I want the human race to keep going. I just like the human race. Sue me. I'm a pervert. Okay, I'm guilty of liking human beings. Sue me. But I really like human beings. I'm very pro-human. And I want humans to live forever. Hitler said 1,000-year Reich. I want a billion year. No, infinite. I want human beings to live forever. I want there always to be human beings. And the more we spread out onto different planets and hopefully different solar systems one day, if we don't blow ourselves up before we get there, well, the more likely you are to have the human race preserved. And I like the human race. I'm pro-human. So that means that we should treat Mars and the moon not like the Soviet Union treated land, but rather the way in the U.S. or Canada, namely private property on the moon or Mars. Okay, now forget about the fact that it was government employees that went to the moon in, 1969, I think it was, the moon shot where people walked around on the moon. The question comes, well, how much of the moon should they get? Should they get the whole moon? And the answer coming from Murray Rothbard is no. And what Murray says is, look, east of the Mississippi in the United States, the land is fertile, and a family of four can not only live on 160 acres, but can't really homestead more than 160 acres. So 160 acres is reasonable. West of the Mississippi, the land is not as fertile, and a family of four would homestead the land not as intensively, but more extensively. And he came up with 1,600 acres, 10 times as much. Namely, a family of four could homestead 1,600 acres because they would do it much more extensively. They would do it with cattle and with horses, and they wouldn't plant every square inch. They'd plant every square yard or something like that. So the same thing goes with the Sahara Desert. If you want to privatize the Sahara Desert, it gets farmed and homesteaded much more extensively, so you get to own more of it for the same effort, just as you got to own more west of the Mississippi than east of the Mississippi. Okay, well now the Moon and Mars are sort of like a super Sahara Desert, so you get to own a lot more for the same effort. So if there were private people that go to the Moon and set up shop there, they could own, 100 square miles, maybe 300 square miles. They don't own the whole Moon. They don't own a quarter of the Moon. They don't own half the Moon, but they own a lot more of the Moon than they would if they just put that much effort into east of the Mississippi. And the same thing with Mars. And we go into this thing, well, suppose what you do in Mars is you set up what do you call it? An atmosphere. I forget what it's called. Do you guys know what it is called when you set up a whole atmosphere on Mars?
The term doesn't come to mind. It doesn't come to mind for me either.
Okay. Well, so how much of Mars would you get to own? Well, in this book, what I say is probably you couldn't do that by yourself because it cost a lot, and there'd probably be 20 people doing it, and maybe then you'd get to own 1/20th of Mars if you did that. Plus, you'd have to homestead. So this book goes into all sorts of issues like that. Well, how much of the Moon do you get? How much of Mars do you get if you
terraforming?
Terraforming. That's it. Terraforming. Thanks. I appreciate it. I'm getting senile. Pretty soon I'll be drooling even more than I'm drooling now. Terraforming, not terraforming, but terraforming, namely forming an atmosphere, forming clouds, and making the Mars more habitable, or doing the same thing with the Moon. So that's one aspect.
Just a quick question. This book, is it writing on other books dealing with the thesis of space colonization in general? Is that something that's really developing in the sciences?
Well, there is space. There are many books, and we have a whole section where we criticize a whole bunch of books that aren't libertarian. There are many, many books on how do we get to the Moon and what do we do when we get there. But I think this is the first and the only book written by libertarians, and it has a certain libertarian slant as to, privatize and homesteading, and John Locke and Murray Rothbard and Hans Hoppe get to the Moon and Mars. So this book is a little different than most of the books. The second part of the book is the space race. Not only when we get there should it be done privately, but also the effort to get there. Now there's this guy, what's his name? The guy who's Elon Musk is a private person. It used to be the way the government was doing it. When you shoot a rocket up, the rocket is in three parts. The first part gets you this high, the second part gets you a little higher, and then the rocket goes off. And what happens to the other two parts? They just fall into the ocean and they're lost. It's as if you take a plane from New Orleans to Dallas and then to Vancouver, and then you have to throw away the plane. It would be very difficult to do. So we credit Elon Musk for coming up with a way of saving the plane or saving the rocket ship so you could use it again a few times, not just once. So he's a great guy. On the other hand, most of his money comes from the government. So
and he welcomes it.
I'm sorry?
He welcomes it and knows it.
He calls himself a socialist.
Well, it gets more complicated, and we go into it in this book because one of my articles was on Ron Paul. Should Ron Paul accept matching funds? When he was running for office, the government was willing to match every dollar that he raised because he was running for office. And the question came, should he accept the money? And another question comes, should we accept Social Security? Should we accept, a public? Should we go to a public school? A lot of libertarians are worried about these issues. My answer is yes. Ron Paul, well, it's more complicated. Ron Paul probably should not have accepted government funds because from a practical point of view, everyone would have said he's a hypocrite. He's against the government. He's taking government funds. But from a theoretical libertarian point of view, my favorite character of my favorite book is Ragnar Danishkold from Atlas Shrugged.
Yep.
Atlas Shrugged, along with Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, were the two books that converted me to libertarianism, thanks to Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden. And my favorite hero in Atlas Shrugged is Ragnar Danishkold. And what did Ragnar Danishkold do? Ragnar Danishkold relieved the government of its ill-gotten gains. Mm-hmm. And what you have to do is look at the government as a vast criminal gang. And if there was a vast criminal private gang, would it be okay to take their money? And the answer is yes, because they're thieves. You can't steal from a thief. You can only liberate from him, right?
Well, only if you
I
give the
feel-
property back to its owners like Ragnar did.
Ideally, you should give it back but we're not discussing that. We're now just this. Look, it's a two-part thing that Ragnar did. First, he took from the government, and then he gave back to Hank Rearden.
Yep.
But we're only discussing the first part. Should he take money from the government? Let's leave alone the question of what he should do with it. Should he take government money? Yes, he should take government money. Dab it. And not only that, but, I used to teach in a public university, the University of Central Arkansas. I started Rutgers University, Stony Brook. They're all public universities. Was I a hypocrite? No. It's okay for libertarians or civilians to take money from the government. The only people who shouldn't take money from government are people who support the government, who ideologically think the government is great. So now, because they're part of the government. I mean, if they support the government, then they're they're aiding and abetting a criminal gang, and they're not good guys. When we have a libertarian Nuremberg trial, they'll be in the dock. So my theory is,
Walter, sorry, I keep on cutting you off, but it's very interesting what you're saying so far.
please.
The principle applies to where Rand has been accused of being a hypocrite because she accepted Social Security, and her justification was, I've been paying into the whole goddamn thing my entire adult life.
Not a good justification. Not a good justification, because suppose she wasn't paying, she still should take money from the government, because the government is a criminal gang, and the less money they have, the better, because they should be relieved of their ill-gotten gains. So if she came from Mars, and a lot of people think she did come from Mars, and she never paid in the Social Security, and somehow the government was offering her Social Security, she still should accept it. Look, in my wallet, let me brag to you, in my wallet, I have a dollar bill. Wait, I have to hold it right side up. Am I therefore in league with the government? By the way, you know how I got to work today? I used a public street. Should I not have used the public street? Sometimes I across the street from me is Audubon Park, which is a public park. I use it. According to the theory that you shouldn't take anything from government, well, the only thing I should do is commit suicide or be a hermit off in the woods. But if you want to live a life, government is so permeates everything that if you want to adhere to this view that you shouldn't take anything from government, suicide is your only out. And libertarianism is not a suicide pact. So my theory is, yes, you can take money from government if you're a libertarian or a civilian, but it would be improper for you to take money from government if you support government. So I'm not against welfare queens, because welfare queens are civilians. They're not really in support. The less money government has, the better. Okay, so now the question comes, is Elon Musk a supporter of government, or is he a libertarian, or is he a civilian? Namely, you can't tell. And what my co-author and I did is we went through a whole bunch of Elon Musk's speeches and publications, and we concluded that he's a commie. He loves government. Yes. Therefore, it's illegitimate for him to take money from government. But you or I, Patrick, Victor, if we took money from government, and I always take money from government. I'm 77 years old. I've been taking Social Security for, 10 years or so, or 12 years. I forget when I started, but I've been taking money proudly. I used to work for a public university, as I mentioned. I took my salary very happily. So it was justified. What was not justified is a Marxist teaching students at a public university. That would be illegitimate. But when we have the libertarian Nuremberg trial, I will not be in the dock, but the Marxist professor who took money from the public sector will be. So I say that
I would have a hard disagree with you there.
How dare you?
I think if we have time, I can make my case. I don't know if we wanted to.
Please shoot.
Go ahead,
so to speak. Patrick.
Okay, so if you benefit materially from the thief's actions in stealing by taking the stolen property, then you become a beneficiary. You become a co-conspirator after the fact with the thief. The thief just does your dirty work for you. I absolutely disagree that you can take stolen property and feel okay about that. But with the caveat, that's not a maximalist position. Like, you are stolen from daily, constantly, in every possible way. income tax, property tax, gas tax, you got to register your car, all this stuff. So as long as you're not taking more than is being taken from you, then there's no issue. But once you kind of cross that line, then you're just in league with the thief. You're a co-conspirator.
Patrick, you live in Texas. Let's say you've never been anywhere else except Texas. Texas is a big place. Even though you're a big guy, Texas is big enough for you. Yeah. But one day you go to Oklahoma, that's a contiguous state, or Arkansas. You've never been in Arkansas or Nebraska or Oklahoma or wherever the other, New Mexico, these contiguous states. You've never paid any taxes for them, and yet you dirty rat, are using their streets.
The government maintains that monopoly by force. It's a non-consensual monopoly, so I'm not too worried about that.
No. You're not justified in. You go to Canada, you visit Victor, and you've never paid any Canadian taxes, and you're using the Canadian. You go to the Canadian Museum, you go to a Canadian library, you go to a Canadian street. You do all sorts of stuff in Canada. You dirty rat, you, and you shouldn't do it.
Well, and the Canadians come here and use the roads here. They're maintained non-consensually in both places.
Two wrongs don't make a right. Just because they do it doesn't mean you should do it. You should not go to Canada. You should not go to Nebraska. You should not go to Minnesota, because you're taking stuff and you've never given anything to them. You've never paid a Minnesota tax in your life. We stipulate. I don't know if you ever lived in Minnesota. Let's say you haven't. You shouldn't go to Minnesota. This is grotesque. You should go to Minnesota. The people who shouldn't go to Minnesota are the Marxists. They should. I won't mention what they should do. But you, libertarian, if you're going to be logically consistent with your view that never take anything unless they've taken from you first, you shouldn't go to Canada, you shouldn't go to Germany, you shouldn't do anything. This is a problematic view.
If the people living in Canada want me to come visit, if Victor wants me to come visit him, then I should be able to come visit him. The land that's publicly owned is just invalidly homesteaded property. It's non-consensually, forcefully captured land.
That's my point, and you're taking it, and that's great. That's exactly my point. You have a right to do it because they're a bunch of thieves, and just because they think they own it, you can go to Stanley Park and wallow around Stanley Park, which is a nice park in Vancouver, even though you never paid for it.
I think there's a disanalogy between forcefully, non-consensually homesteaded property and actual property taken from my bank account or taken from my home. For example, if the government steals my car, somebody else just can't take possession of my car and be like, "Oh, I got a free car because I stole from the thief." That's my car. You can't have it. I don't consent.
Right now, the government does take people's cars. It's really horrible, this seizure of cars. And right now, the government's got your car. And I'm thinking of grabbing it. Well, which would you prefer, that the government keep it or that I get it?
I want my car back. And if you get my car, I would expect you to give it back to me. And I think ethically, I would be justified in using force to repossess myself of my car, even from you, because that's my car. The ownership never changes.
You didn't answer my question. Let me repeat the question. Which would you prefer if that was your only choice?
I don't have to have a preference. I want my car back in my possession.
You're ignoring my question. My question is, who would you rather have that car? The government to ride around in it and arrest people or whatever, or me? I could use it to promote liberty, or let's say I'm a civilian. I'm non-political. I tell you this: if the government took my car, I would rather that anyone took it from them than the government keep it, because the government is a thief. Now, better to have somebody else take it than the government keep it.
I mean, that's a subjective preference.
It doesn't.
We'll have to agree to disagree.
I mean, do you disagree that I would be rightful in using force to repossess my car from you if you took it from the government?
I agree with you entirely, but that's not the issue. The issue I'm raising is, who should have that car? Not you. Obviously, you should have the car. It's your car, for God's sake. We're libertarians here. We're not going to disagree on that. The question is, who should have the car, me or the government? Let me give you another example. We're in Nazi Germany, and I break into the garage of Nazi Germany, and I start pouring gasoline over all the cars and stuff. And some German comes in there and says, "Hey, wait, that's my car. Get that gasoline off." And I say, "Oh, it's your car. How come you didn't take it back?" He said, "Well, I'm scared," or whatever. Am I justified in blowing up his car that's now in the Nazi possession? I think so. Because the Nazis are bad, we stipulate that, and they're going to use that car to put a machine gun in, and that's bad. And better that car be destroyed than that the Nazis keep it. Now, obviously, better if the owner had it, yes, but that's not the issue. The issue is me or the Nazis, or I burn it. Better to burn a private car that's in Nazi possession.
I don't think you get to make decisions for other people's car.
Well, I'm an anti-Nazi. I'm burning that car. I'm making a decision for that car because that car can be used to kill innocent people. And the Nazis are bad. We stipulate that. Look, we'll have to agree to disagree because I want to talk about a few other things.
Maybe we can have another talk soon.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I really don't think that the principle that you're standing on, Patrick, is not diminished. It doesn't mean, of course, Walter ultimately agrees that the person who was stolen from is ultimately his property. That's acknowledged. But the unfortunate tragedy of the government, that even when it comes to the border issue, open or closed, it's a disaster. It impedes the principle. It snaps it right in half. There's nothing that you can do that can really be considered right or wrong unless it's a subjective view, and that's fine. That's how all-encompassing the force is that it snaps the principle involved altogether. That's what I would argue on the case. But anyway, you want to make some final points in regards to the final book in the trilogy, Walter? And then maybe we'll get to
that was the final book. Now, I promised an hour, and we've already been about an hour and a half. So let me just talk about the last point that I wanted to talk about, and that is the front lawn fornicator.
Yeah, okay. That's right. Okay. Yeah, okay. I remember that. Yeah.
So what the front lawn fornicator does is he fornicates on his front lawn. And he scares the horses, and he scares the kids, and everybody's upset. And, this is really disgusting. I mean, if you want to have sexual intercourse, go in your house and close the door and have sexual intercourse on a voluntary basis. But no. The front lawn fornicator has got to do it out on his front lawn. So my view, there are some critics of libertarianism who opposing as libertarians, and they're not really libertarians on this issue because they disagree with me. I'm just kidding. What they say is that the non-aggression principle and private property rights are not enough. And they use the front lawn fornicator as an example. And they say, look, the front lawn fornicator is not violating rights. It's his lawn. He's not initiating violence against anyone else. He's making love to his wife. He's a fine. And yet there's a problem. So we need more than the private property rights, and we need more than the non-aggression principle. We need culture, or we need, I don't know what we need. We need more, and I don't think we need any more. To my way of thinking, private property rights and the non-aggression principle is it. That's it for libertarianism. We don't have to add anything else. So how can we have our cake and eat it? How can we preclude the front lawn fornicator who doesn't violate rights, and yet we want to preclude him? Well, let me not say we want to preclude him, because in our area we want to preclude him, but there might be a libertine area, a semi-libertarian arena, or a semi-libertarian area would be front lawn fornicating is allowed. A radical libertine area would be you have to fornicate on your front lawn at least once a week, or once a day and twice on Sundays. That would be the radical. I'm sorry?
You got to swap partners.
Oh, you have to swap partners. You have to do this. You have to do that. So my answer to that is, look, if I have a square mile and I want to develop it and I want to sell it to 640 people in the form of 1 acre each, if I just sell it to people with no strings attached, I'm not going to make much money, because most people are going to preclude anticipate this and going to say, well, how are you going to stop the front lawn fornicator? We're a pure libertarian society, so there's no law against it. There can't be a law against it because it's not a crime. And in my third book in the Defending the Undefendable series, I've got the front lawn fornicator as hero. So what I do is I sell you the land with a proviso. It's sort of like a condominium association. And I sell you the land with the proviso, not only on the front lawn fornicator, but I already have pipes in there and electric wires and sewage wires, because if I don't have sewage wires and sewage pipes and water pipes and electrical things running around, the 640 of you are going to have a very difficult time figuring out who should be the sewage company and who should be the water company. So what I'm doing is I'm selling you the land with a whole bunch of provisos, Blockian type provisos, not only on long, thin things like wires and pipes and stuff, but also on front lawn fornicating. But not only that, because it's impossible to anticipate all sorts of weird things that people will do. Like if I sell it to you on the grounds that there's no front lawn fornicating, how about masturbation? Somebody gets out in front lawn and starts masturbating, or somebody does something else weird. So what I do is I say, I'm selling this as part of a condominium association, and there are 640 of you, 1 acre each. And, here are the rules, but you guys can change it if you want. So if we forgot to put in no masturbation on the front lawn, well, with a vote of, I don't know what the vote is, 60% or just a majority vote, you can change it. So we then can have our cake and eat it. We can have private property rights, and we don't have any front lawn fornicators unless they're a libertarian society and they want that. But for normal people, we don't want that. So we can preclude it without violating rights and without adding anything to libertarian theory.
Right. So the basic principle here is as colorful as and humorous as examples that you're using. The same principle would apply to some guy and his dog taking a crap on your lawn, right? Like,
well, not on your lawn, but on his lawn.
Likely to happen.
You see, if the dog took a crap on your lawn, that's a trespass. But suppose he took a crap on his own lawn and he never cleaned it up, and now it smells. Well, one way to stop that is you have a city government and they pass a law against it. That's not the libertarian way. Another way is this condominium association where the condominium, let's say we didn't put in the contract the dogs pooping on your own land. Well, now we see you do it, Victor, you dirty rat. And we pass a new rule for our condominium association. I was
Patrick, go ahead.
I was in a libertarian meeting in Paul Geddes' house, and he lives in a condo association, and he was complaining bitterly about all sorts of rules that they have. You have to paint the house a certain way. In some condos, the drape has to be the same. You can't have blue or green drapes. It's got to be pink or whatever. And I said, but you agreed to this. Shut up. And it was a hard sell. I'm trying to promote liberty among this meeting at this libertarian meeting.
I absolutely agree with your stance. If you agree to the contract when you buy the property, then you have agreed to the contract. And if the contract includes a provision for voting on future rule changes, you agree to that. I'm bound in an HOA here in the house I'm in now. I don't like everything they choose to, but I can't say they force on me. They don't force rules on me. I don't like all the rules, but I agreed to them. Yeah.
Oh, you can sell your condo and move to another condo where the rules are more congruent with your views.
I agree.
Now, very good. Now, Walter, we did extend the talk. I've enjoyed myself tremendously, and that's why the time flew by. And I was thinking about doing a tight 30-minute show. But I think a lot of the things that you've covered, I think, are very important. Anybody who has trying to conceive of a stateless society, or one that fully recognizes property rights and finds some of these issues of how the roads and then the rivers, how all of that would work, I would say that probably your 3 books in the trilogy could meet the standard of being definitive works dealing with these questions.
You're very kind. Thanks, and thanks for having me on your show. Have a good night, guys.